Earlier this year, specifically in February 2023, I made a short trip of the United States, and the last but one destination I was in was San Diego. As you can see here from my hotel window, I could see USS Midway, which was the reason I was here, because the Western Naval Historical Association conference was going on, and a couple of her successors, CVN 70 and CVN 72, were just across the water. But it was now time for me to embark on the last leg of my trip. A literal midnight flight took off at 23:59, skipping through a time zone or two to land in Texas, grab a hire car at some unearthly hour of the morning, and head down to Galveston. And well, when you get to Galveston, at least at the moment, you find something truly special. You see, the fine folks who manage the Battleship Texas had invited me to come and take a look at the ship. And so, entering the Gulf Copper Shipyard car park, this was the first view that I could get, close up at least, of the legendary Battleship. But it gets better. It gets so much better. The first thing to do was, of course, to check in, meeting some familiar faces, as a number of people from the Battleship Texas Foundation had been at the Historical Naval Ships Association conference back in September last year, but also a bunch of new faces who were all very friendly. Then I had a very pleasant conversation with a couple of subscribers who'd actually showed up for the dockyard tour that was starting off the day. And incidentally, at the time that this video goes up, there are May, June and July dates available for the Battleship Texas Drydock tours. They're still going on, so go to battleshiptexas.org/drydock and you can book yourself a tour if you happen to be in the area. But then it was time to actually head for the ship. So going through the gates, this is what you see first, a bow-on view. Now, of course, the view that you get will be slightly different from the view that I got because the ship's in dry dock for work to be done and that work is still ongoing. However, at the time of my visit, the particular circumstances of where the work was afforded some rather unique views, one of which you can see here, specifically to do with the bulges or anti-torpedo blisters that were installed way back and which are being replaced. So let's take a little bit of a closer look. So you can see here, on your left, the ship's right or starboard side, is the section of new blister work that was being installed. On your right, or the ship's left port side, you can see the old blister that is going to be removed, and down there in front you can see a bunch of the scrap metal that's come off of the ship. So yeah, there's a fair bit there. Nonetheless, you can see that the profiles are largely the same above the waterline, but if you look carefully, and unfortunately there is some scaffold towers down there so it does obscure the view slightly, you'll notice that the view at the bottom is slightly different. But there is a very good reason for this. Part of the problem that Texas has had in the past with flooding and rust and so on and so forth has been to do with the shape of the original blisters. You can see roughly the shape of the original hull, and you can see how the original blisters fare in under that hull, and this creates a very narrow, confined space, which is very difficult to access, very difficult to inspect, very difficult to pump water completely out of, and of course if the water sits down there, not only will it rust away happily at the hull and the blister, but it creates a very damp and moist environment inside the rest of the torpedo defense void, which is also not good for the rest of it. Whereas you can see on the left-hand side, the blisters cut off at a sharp 90-degree angle. Now granted, this isn't the best thing hydrodynamically, by a couple of percentage points, and of course if the ship was actually facing torpedo attack then that lower section would be somewhat more vulnerable, but fortunately Texas is a museum ship now. She's very unlikely to be facing torpedo attack anytime soon, and by having that sharp cut off at the bottom, it means that if there is any future water infiltration into the blisters, then it will be easy to pump out, it'll be easy to check, it'll be easy to maintain, and it'll be easy to eradicate any last bits of standing water. So this is a very cunning preservation technique, and of course it doesn't affect the appearance of the ship in the slightest once it's back in the water, and the blisters will still provide in more than enough buoyancy to help her stay at the appropriate level. And if you look slightly further up, you can also see that on the Texas's starboard side, some of the 5-inch guns are present there in their casemates. On the port side, which obviously is inverted because we're looking at it from bow on, the 5-inch guns are off board in the process of being restored. And this is how the mighty battleship sits within the scope of the floating dry dock itself. The entrance, in case you're interested, is over there on the photo's left-hand side. And then as we approach down the quay, you begin to appreciate just how large this ship is. I've mentioned before in videos about other museum ships that presentation can be very key. A ship that's identical to another museum ship, like the Iowas or the Essexes, might appear to be very much larger or very much smaller, depending on how close you are to the waterline when you approach her. With Texas, although she is obviously somewhat smaller than an Iowa, North Carolina or a South Dakota class battleship, the fact that she's currently out of the water gives you a lot of additional height to appreciate, and, well, you can see the effect. And that effect only gets larger the closer you get to the ship. Now, here is a very good perspective that shows you just where this work was in mid to late February 2023. So you can see the forward part of the new blisters on the starboard side have been completed. The framing hasn't quite gone in yet further down, roughly amidships, and since they're in the process of putting some of the outer plating on, you can see there right below the bridge, as far as perspective goes from this shot, not actually right next to the bridge, probably actually more next to the second turret, you can see there's an open section which shows the new frames that are supporting the new outer skin of the blisters. And we can get a bit more up close and personal, so you can see that gap with the new framing on board. And you can also see just up there to the left, these two large squares in white. These are to do with how the ship was manoeuvred into dock and taken from its original place in the first place. So if you go back to Battleship Texas Foundation's YouTube channel, you should be able to see how the ship was moved from its old resting place to the new dry dock for its refit, and you'll be able to see how those were utilised to avoid extra damage to the ship. You can also see the various layers of paint as they're being removed or being let to fall off, because of course the ship will be getting a brand new paint job as well. And now we're actually inside the floating dry dock. You can also see back there where all the old frames have been either removed or where they've rusted away over time, and where they're waiting to receive the new blisters. And this shot, looking towards the bow, gives you some idea of the plating that's going onto those new blisters, but also the very, very complex geometry that makes up the ship's bow. You can see from the shadows and the curves, there's a lot of plating involved here that isn't just flat steel, and all of this needs to be preserved. And as I mentioned with the original blisters, any of these curves can leave small, very inaccessible spaces, which make preserving a ship like Texas, or indeed any large museum ship, quite a challenge. And under the ship here you can see one of the little docking keels that helps keep the ship on the blocks. So you've got the main ship's keel, which you can see further back and which we'll have a closer look at a bit later on. And then you've got this much smaller, not actually a full keel, but still referred to as such because it's on the other side of the ship. And as you can see, with it sitting on this dry dock block, this is how you get a ship to actually stay relatively upright whilst it's in dry dock. Because with older ships, you would have to prop and shape all of the dry dock blocks to the hull, which is fine if you're talking about 1.5 foot or more of oak in an old Age of Sail ship. But when you're talking about a steel warship, if you don't have these in place, then you'd be putting blocks and potentially props straight up against hull plating, and that hull plating may not necessarily be particularly strong, and your block might not be large enough to spread the load out far enough that it actually catches part of the ship's structure. Whereas these smaller full skeels running the length of the ship, or most of the length of the ship, ensure that the load is evenly distributed and the ship doesn't just roll over. And this is a view under those new blisters, so you can see there that horizontal cutoff which I described earlier, and the space you can see between that and the black painted portions of the ship's hull just to the right in this image. That is the area that was covered by the previous torpedo blisters, and so hopefully you can get a further appreciation from this view of how those blisters curving in would create a very tight and confined space. You can see the scaffold tower there for scale, so a person could be standing on that and take up about half the height of that total scaffold tower, and you can see how that would then, if you have a bit of hull plating sweeping in, create a very, very narrow space that's basically impossible to get to and monitor, or indeed drain very easily. And you can see here again, approaching the bow, the kind of complex curvature that's involved with the overhead of the new blisters in place and then the line where the old blister met, which helps to emphasize the point still more. Now, it must be pointed out, you don't have to worry about the deflection that you can see here too much. This is actually fairly standard for a ship of this size and certainly of this age. It's actually a relatively minor deflection, all things considered, and therefore, you know, it's not something that's going to need any real correcting. But yes, those are some holes that have been cut in the underside of the ship. Obviously, they'll be patched before the ship goes back in the water. These are for drainage and ventilation whilst the ship is in dry dock, and more on those a bit later. And from this shot, again looking towards the bow, you can again see part of the new blister work, some of the exposed patching that won't be now covered with a blister, but you can also see the legacy of extensive refits, repairs, retrofits, and patching that's been done basically ever since the ship put to sea. So it's not like Texas came in as a museum ship with a completely pristine underside. She had been through numerous refits and certain degree of modernization in her active service career, and that work continues to a certain extent to this day. But coming back out to the exterior, this is a closer up view of further down the ship's starboard side, where, as I've mentioned earlier, you can see where existing frames and supports have been cut away, and you can see where that's been primed, ready to receive the new blisters. But then up there in the top left of the photo, you can also see some of what's left of the existing structure that has yet to be cut away, or maybe won't be cut away at all, and you can see just how thin some of those had rusted through. At the HNSA conference last year, we were given an excellent presentation which showed some of these in situ when the old blister was still in place, and, well, the words, "this frame has basically collapsed," came up a few times, and, well, you can kind of see why. Not just why they collapsed, but why the ship is in such dire need of this dry docking. The Battleship Texas Foundation obviously having moved almost literally heaven and earth to get the ship from the state she was in when they got their hands on her to the state she's in now, where she's hopefully going to be made good for many years to come. Now, this slightly zoomed out view is actually very interesting to me because we're about halfway down the ship, and you can see here with the blisters removed, the old ones that is, and the new ones not yet installed, just how slab-sided the ship actually was, how square in cross-section a dreadnought battleship is amidships, because as you can see, there's none of this kind of gently curving, constantly curving side, which is what you see when the blisters are in place, and which we will see when we go around the other side. In this area, it's just essentially straight down, and then you have this regular curve that turns into the underside of the ship, and then the underside is actually pretty flat as well. This maximizes space internally to the ship and makes it relatively simple to build. But one area that very definitely isn't slab-sided is this part. This is the stern, and as you can see here, the exact profile of the old blister is fully visible, and you can see just how far back the blisters actually went, albeit, as you can see from the overhang at the top, there wasn't a tremendous amount to them at this stage. And that caused some issues, which you can probably see from this photo, but which we will also be taking a much closer look at. Just underneath the profile of the blister, roughly in the middle of this photo, you can actually see where one of the propeller shafts actually exited the hull. Texas no longer has her propellers, so that's all been capped off and sealed. And over there behind the scaffold tower, you can also see the rudder, which is at 12 degrees to starboard and ain't going anywhere. Now, if there's one photo that encapsulates the kind of problems that Texas was facing in her original berth, this is probably one of the strongest contenders, because, as you can see, this is a slightly closer up view of that end of the blister profile, and it perfectly illustrates the point I've been making with some of these other photos. That overhang you can see above gives you some idea of how much depth there was to the blister as it fared back into the original hull. And you can see that over on our left, towards the stern of the ship, the rust there is really awful, but it actually trends out, and although there's still rust, the material condition of the hull gets better and better the further forward you get, which corresponds to how much more space there is as regulated by that overhang above. And then you've got the bit of a hull that was right next to it that was out in the water, just to the left-hand side of this picture, and you can see that that condition is better still. And this is entirely because, as I mentioned earlier, water was able to pool and high moisture levels were able to build in the very narrow profile sections of the blisters, which physically could not be accessed. You're talking about a gap of a few inches there. And as that water settles in and just sits there, you get conditions like you can see there at the very end of the blister fairing. And here, of course, is the famous rudder. They actually have t-shirts. I don't know if they sell them in their shop. If not, they should, but I'm fairly sure they actually do. I think you can get t-shirts and posters related to come and try and move it or come and shift it or something like that. But yes, poor old Texas's rudder, for whatever reason, when it was initially installed as a museum ship, at some point ended up with this slight turn to starboard, and over the years has now decided it's going to stay in that place. So this is an example of a semi-balanced rudder. So you can see it has this little fairing coming forward from the rudder post as well as the main rudder further aft. And that helps a nice balance between ease of actually changing the rudder's direction when it's working, and also making sure that you're deflecting enough water that the ship turns relatively smartly. And here's an up-close and personal shot of that tail end of the old blister fairing, which I mentioned earlier. And you can see how the underlying hull plate runs one into the other. And bear in mind, obviously, that that hull plating you can see to the left was just as exposed to water. In fact, it was completely immersed in water, as opposed to the fairing on the right, the difference being the high moisture environment. And of course, as flooding ebbed and flowed and water evaporated, not only did you have high moisture but a constantly changing water level, which wreaked far more much damage. Plus, of course, as you can see here, from when the fairing was barely had any profile above the hull, there was no way that anyone could actually get in there to repaint the hull material, whereas on the left, the external part, that at least could be patched up and painted quite regularly. And then looking back down from the stern, you can see how far they've got with the sandblasting and derusting and priming sections. And by the time this video goes out, the blisters will have moved considerably further down this side of the ship. And if you happen to go there, maybe this entire side of the ship will now be covered. Who knows? Just off to the left there, you can also see, now looking forward, you can see the capped end of one of the propeller shafts. And then swinging around from the point where I took that photo, here is a nice close-up of the rudder in all of its glory. And yes, I can confirm, no, you cannot shift it, no matter how hard you try. And the view from the other side as we come round to the ship's port side, which obviously is in a, at the least at the time of these photos being taken, was in a slightly less advanced state of repair, because they'd started on the forward starboard side and were working their way aft, and then they're going to come back round the other way. And just to the bottom left, you can see a cruise ship. I think that one was on its way out. Galveston seems to be a very busy port for cruise ships, so we saw several actually come in and out just on the time that we were in the dock. So if you happen to be on a cruise ship, you can all in that area, you can wave to Texas as she sits there quite happily in the floating dry dock. But swinging our view around forward, now you get a nice cross-section of the original blisters. You can see there's been a number of holes already cut into the side, some bits of it removed, and closer to us the entire blister has been removed, with further holes cut into the hull there. Now you might be wondering, what are all these square holes for? Well, the internal square holes, that was to allow them to fill the blisters with foam for her transit, to make sure she made the transit safely and correctly. And then these outer holes that you can see in the blister itself, those were cut to help them get rid of the foam, because when they're taking the blisters off, they want to be able to get the metal off. They don't want to have to be trying to take the metal off, which obviously requires welders and cutters and all sorts of high heat tools, with a bunch of flammable foam immediately behind it, and even if it doesn't burn, it's going to give off a lot of nasty fumes. And so these outer holes allow them to essentially jet blast the foam out, which then leaves the metal available to be cut away. And you can see just at the top middle, some of that sort of white incrustation, that's actually little bits of foam that have remained stuck on. And then here in this wider shot, you can see some of the work that's going on further forward on the ship, which has already taken down some of the blister, and actually provides a very good idea, again, and I know like it sounds like I'm harping on about this, but it is absolutely key to understanding just how Texas has arrived in the condition she was in beforehand, and why the measures to recover her from that are taking a slightly different form than pure restoration of visual effect. You can actually see here from one of the dividing sections of the blister that's on the right hand side of the photo, you can see that narrowing down I was speaking about in full effect. Plus you can see all the windows and the strakes that have been cut to remove some of the foam, and just down there at the bottom on the left hand side of the photo you can see a pile of foam bits and pieces that have been jet washed out. Coming forward, this is the Midships section where a good chunk of the blister siding has been removed, and although you can see further forward on some of those dividing bulkheads where they've been cut through, you can also see on this nearest one that's fully exposed where the rust has actually gone up and eaten its way through most of it. So, some of the big holes that would have allowed flooding to spread along the blisters as well, which wouldn't have been particularly helpful back, 15-20 years ago when the ship was over in San Jacinto. And you can also see the sheer scale of just how much steel is being removed from the ship, which helps explain some of that massive pile of steel that you saw earlier at the bow of the ship, which is partly being recycled and partly being turned into little souvenirs that you can buy to help support the restoration of the ship. And here on the section that has mostly yet to be removed, you can see some of that foam still in situ. A lot of it has already been jet blasted out, but some of it still remains, although I suspect that by the time you're seeing this, that's also long gone. And on the exterior of the blisters, you can see, again, as I've mentioned before, how much patchwork has been done to the ship over her lifetime, because you can see you've got the original profile, but then kind of center left, you've got this big patch and then a square inside that, and then above it, a square patch and a round patch over that. And all of this is obviously done to the blisters after the main blister has been installed. And another close-up of the docking keel on the var side, you can see, or port side I guess, you can see how the actual blocks are made up. Nowadays you've got this concrete block which forms the main height of it, and then you have several layers of wood on top of that, and then the ship rests on the wood. And you can see how the weight of the ship has pressed that wood down on both of those blocks, and indeed across everywhere where the ship is resting on said blocks. This is also what allows them to move the blocks around slightly so that they can access different portions of the ship, because with the blocks spaced out nice and regularly, it means you can knock out those wood covered top sections, move the main block to a different area, and then put in some more wood paneling, and then some wooden wedges can be hammered in to support the ship in the block's new location, which means that you're not going to be left with a series of patches where the blocks were and the ship left untreated in those areas. And if you're wondering how you get into a torpedo blister to take some of the photos like Battleship Texas Foundation has released over the years, well, here's a ladder coming from the top, and this is how they would have originally gotten in, albeit obviously, as you can see, the lower part of the ladder has also been removed as part of the ongoing works. I'm sure if someone offers them a premium, they'll be happy to sell you the rest of that ladder. It will weigh a bit, but hey, how many times can you say you've got an authentic battleship ladder? And now looking back towards the stern, you can once again see how at this stage the overhang is quite large, and you can see from the ladder, which obviously is something that a person can scale, just how much space there is in the void areas in this portion of the blister. And therefore it comes as relatively little surprise that when you look at the main plating, it's actually in relatively decent condition for a bunch of exposed metal that's been subject to a lot of water, whereas once again when you look right down at the bottom, where, as I mentioned extensively before, it was very difficult to get access to that section, the rust is considerably worse. I mean, also that's where water will pool naturally because it's at the lowest portion of the ship. The other interesting thing here is looking at the difference in hull profile. So that chunk of old blister there on the right hand side, and you can see how the hull profile is completely different there, and you can imagine it running along with these other partial frame remains here as compared to the profile of the original hull, which is now exposed. And as we come to the forward part of the port side of the ship, if you ignore the holes that have been cut to get rid of the foam, you can see this is what the profile of the full part of the hull looked like with the original blisters in place, because again, this portion, most of the original blister work is still in place, at least circa February. And then as we go further forward still, And we've come round to the ship's bow. You can see you have this, it's not exactly a ram bow, but it's very slightly ram-like. But then you also have this little attachment right down on the chin with these two holes through it. Now, what might this be, you wonder? Well, this is actually part of the ship's paravane system. So you've heard me mention these before. They look a little bit like winged torpedoes, and they are a way for even a large ship to do some basic minesweeping work. The problem, of course, being that if you run your paravanes with cables from the top of the ship, then those cables go out at a diagonal, which means mines that are passing close to your hull won't be caught by them. So this is one of the ways you ensure that that doesn't happen. You have cables or chains running through here, and that's why you have a paravane going port, paravane going starboard, hence two holes. And that means that the cable starts close to the ship, right down at not quite keel level, because as you can see the hull is curving up a bit, but near enough. And then the paravanes go out on either side, and that ensures that you have a continuous line of underwater chain or cable which can then cut the mooring lines for mines that you might otherwise have run into. And in this portrait shot you get to see the full profile of the bow. Now, as I said, it's kind of a ram bow. Technically speaking, the layout, the shaping merits the term ram bow, but it's also technically not a ram bow in that if you look at something like, say, a Victoria-class ironclad, there will be a big heavy chunk of iron, especially strengthened, sticking out the front in this lower area, designed specifically to serve as a ram, whereas on Texas, although you've got this kind of slightly bulbous protrusion, this is not designed to ram a vessel, even though it could if you got that close. It's just another part of the hull. And this is one of the great joys of actually getting to see a ship like this in the dry dock, because if you were seeing the ship either before it went into dry dock or indeed after, once they fixed her up and put her in her new home, then the grey bit up top is pretty much what you would see out of the water, which looks impressive and all, but you can see when you're basically underneath it, it looks even more impressive. You appreciate just how much of this ship is present underwater and how much larger it is. You get a similar effect if you go and see Vasa in Sweden. Now, if you go and see Vasa and you see HMS Victory in Portsmouth, you will initially come away with the impression that Vasa is the bigger ship. In fact, Vasa is considerably smaller than Victory, but because you can see all of Vasa from keel upwards from your normal point of view, she appears larger. Whereas, again, here with Texas, because you're looking at her from below the keel and upwards, she looks massively more intimidating and massively taller than a good number of museum ships that are actually physically larger than she is. But when you visit them, you can only see from the waterline up. So it really is a unique opportunity because, one, battleships don't go into dry dock very often. Two, this particular battleship won't be going into dry dock again anytime soon. And three, there's no guarantee if any of the other battleships or heavy cruisers, etc., go into dry dock at some point in the future, that those dry docks will be as accommodating as Gulf Copper have been in allowing people to actually go in and see the ship. But if you absolutely can't make it for whatever reason, well, that's what this video is for. You get to see some of the glory and the majesty of this really old ship as we go around her in the dry dock. And come on, I mean, the ship is so photogenic, especially round the bow. So let's just take a moment and enjoy some glorious beauty shots. I mean, the sun was also helping very much in this endeavour, but let's admit the ship is really, really a centrepiece when it comes to this kind of view. But it's also interesting to see what kind of pictures come out from the same view from people using different camera setups and different cameras. Because, for example, this photo, just taken just to the starboard side of the bow, was taken by my DSLR. So that's a Sony RX10 IV, good lens, decent CCD, and you get this lighting profile, at least under the default settings. Whereas when I took pretty much exactly the same photo, not having moved from this particular place, but using my phone, you get a very different set of lighting going on and a very different appearance. Now, If you've taken some photos and you think they're pretty good, worth looking at, then obviously let us know in the comments below, and maybe share some with Battleship Texas Foundation. I'm sure they'd love some photos to use for their own publicity as well. And some of you who were following my trip will recognize this particular photo, because this is the one I think I put up on Twitter at the time. And that's before you start playing around with them, because this is the first of the two photos, just with a slight difference on the lighting and clarity sliders. I actually quite like this photo. But of course, we've seen port side, we've seen starboard side. There is one other side that can be seen from down here in the Drydock. Now, this is not normally something you'll get on the Drydock tour, so this is a little bit of an exclusive. Can you guess where we're going from the fact we're now somewhat under the ship? The answer being, yep, we are going completely under the ship. This is underneath USS Texas. So there's several tens of thousands of tons of battleship directly above us, supported by some concrete and a bit of wood. And yeah, it's an interesting experience. If you've seen Battleship New Jersey's video, they did a paired video with Battleship Texas Foundation. Ryan went down there. Ironically enough, Ryan came down the weekend after me, so you'll see him looking around the ship when the ship is displaying a week's further work from what you'll see here. But he obviously did a bunch of filming. I was taking a bunch of photos and desperately trying to listen to what was being told to me. So different perspectives, but here you can see this is what the underneath of a battleship looks like. And once again, you can see that we have a bunch of holes cut in there. Now mostly for drainage and ventilation, because we're well past the blisters, so this is directly into the ship itself. And if you're wondering just how much metal separates the bit where the water is supposed to be from the bit where the water isn't supposed to be, well, there you go. It's not actually that thick at all. This is why underwater explosives were so lethal to ships, because you've seen how extensive the blister work actually is, and the blister work is obviously retrofitted onto a ship that wasn't designed with all that much in the way of underwater protection in the first place. Whereas here, which is where you'd have magnetic mines, magnetic influence torpedoes and so forth exerting their strength, this is basically your defense. I mean, sure, the ship's got a double-bottomed hull, so there'd be another similar layer of plating somewhat above it, but it's not a huge amount of steel. Now, although the wind-water line, i.e. the area where the air and the water interact and wash up and down the side of a ship, is usually where you get the most rusting, it doesn't mean that the rest of the ship further underwater is immune from it. It just means it's less worn less quickly. And as you can see here, this is an area where the hull had actually rusted through entirely. It didn't leave behind this wonderful multispectral color pattern. That's a combination of a little bit of paint that was put to highlight the area to contractors, plus the fact we're shining a light on it whilst we're down here. But nonetheless, you saw how thick that plating was originally, and, well, rust has eaten completely through it in this area. So there's not many times in your life where you can say you've stuck your head into the underside of a battleship, so having been afforded the opportunity, of course I was going to do that. Now, as I mentioned, obviously the ship does have a double bottom, so having stuck our head through the outer layer of plating, you can see we have these girders with the holes in them on the bottom part of the picture. They are spacing the outer hull plating from the inner plating, and you can see there's a hatch that's been lifted. So that's an inspection hatch that would, in battleship's lifetime in service, allow the crew to check that this area is in fact watertight, whilst also obviously being able to be bolted down to ensure that it's the engine room above it stays watertight even if this outer area is breached. And so yes, you can see an active part of the ship's internal machinery through that little hatch. And of course, we saw that little rust hole through the underside of the ship earlier, so obviously water did get into this area at some point as well. So you can see there is a rather interesting colour scale of rust going on here, but unlike the area affected by the blisters, whilst there's a fair bit of surface rust, what you'll also notice is that there hasn't been all that much eating through of support members in this area, which is good because that basically means if you come in and clean this up, maybe give it a quick dash of paint or some other form of preservative, this area will be pretty much good to go. Whereas, well, as you can see with the blisters, those are just coming straight off. Another interesting thing you can see in the top left and on the top right is the rivets, because of course this ship was riveted together because it's a World War I, or actually technically just pre-World War I vintage vessel, whereas some of the newer museum ships you might see use either partial or complete welding. So the overlapping plates and the rivets are, to the extent that they're present on Texas, are something of a unique feature in large US museum ships. To my recollection, the only other relatively large US museum ship that has riveting to this extent is Olympia, and she is of course significantly smaller than Texas. You can also see there, obviously there is pipework running through the ship in this area, and well, these outer areas were used for a variety of purposes during the ship's lifetime. Initially, obviously just as basic underwater protection, but as you can see from that line there on the top right, they were at some point also used as holding areas for fuel, and so these pipelines would act, depending on which portion of the ship you're in the double bottom, either as potentially ways of pumping water out or potentially ways of pumping fuel in and out, depending on what period the pipes align with and which particular sections they serve. And then looking straight up through another section, you can again see part of the machinery spaces of Texas just literally sitting a couple of feet above your head, which is a little bit of a weird thing, I must admit, to be looking up into the machinery spaces, which are traditionally the lowest portions of the ship, but there you go. Bonus points and a small prize, if I can work out how to contact you, if you're the first person in the comments to tell us which exact part of Texas's lowest areas this is that we're looking up into. And if you're part of Battleship Texas Foundation, please don't cheat and spoil it for everyone else. Let them work it out first. It'd be interesting to see how many people actually know from what's admittedly a relatively limited shot from an unusual angle. Well, alright, here's a photo through the hatch as well. This might be a slightly easier guess. So I guess there's two guesses. So this is picture 2, the previous one was picture 1. So 2 people would be in the running for little prizes if they can guess which bit's which. And yes, I know that's an electric light up there. Come on, it's the 21st century. We're not going to use oil lamps and so forth. Apart from anything else, whilst Texas was built partly by the use of mules, she was still a ship of the 20th century, so electric lighting was on board even from the very, very beginning. Now, emerging back out into the open, we're just taking a slightly closer look there at the starboard side propeller shaft, which has been capped off, to give you an idea of what that looks like. And here's some more of that foam that was taken out the ship. Now, the video's coming up for 40 minutes, so I'm going to start wrapping it up here, but we're not even halfway through. So, before we wrap up here, many, many thanks to all the fine people at Battleship Texas Foundation who not only invited me to come and have a look at the ship, but took me to the areas that you've seen so far and were incredibly accommodating and obviously very knowledgeable about the ship that they all know and love so much. And as I said, if you can make it down there, not only does it help support the ship when you pay to go on these tours, but you will have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have a look around a ship in Drydock. But as I said, the fun doesn't end there, because we're only about halfway through the photos that I took. So you might be thinking, Drac, what on earth could you possibly show us? We've literally been around the ship, and we've been under the ship. We've even been very marginally inside the ship. Well, there's your clue, because after a rather nerve-wracking climb up the exterior of the Drydock, on a rather see-through set of stairs, we came to here, and as you can see, yes, on the left, that is a bridge. I am about to go aboard USS Texas while she is in Drydock, and we're going to look through a lot of the ship. So, tune in next time in a few weeks or maybe a month or two's time when I get round to putting together the second one of these videos together, and we'll all take a look both at the exterior of USS Texas up top, and then diving down into the magazines, the machinery, the propeller shafts, the shell hoists, the interior of the turrets, and so much more beside. There's a lot to look forward to next time on our tour of Battleship Texas.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for Drydock questions.